Would you believe that an ordinary evening in a restaurant could turn into a detective story with elements of drama? What if I told you that at the center of this story is not the chef, not the customer, but a humble dishwasher girl with a big backpack and secrets you definitely don't expect to hear? You ready? Then buckle up, we're starting. James sat in his office, lazily scrolling through the footage from the newly installed surveillance cameras. He'd never been paranoid, but knowing that somewhere in his restaurant food or dishes were leaking kept him on his toes. A new business is as much about the joy of fulfilling a dream as it is about the headaches of small problems. 3 days ago, he installed cameras, hoping it would spare him from suspicion. And now, revisiting the footage once again, he'd come across footage of Emily, a humble dishwasher with a perpetual backpack over her shoulders, gliding toward the exit. Something about her demeanor was jarring. Her movements were quick, as if she didn't want to be seen. Emily? Come on, she's the kind of person who wouldn't even hurt a fly, James thought, but the feeling of unease only increased. He knew her as a sweet, quiet girl who always did the dishes on time, didn't complain, and even stayed late if she had to. But this backpack here? Big, bulging, like a good half of the warehouse was hidden inside. Okay, something's not right here, James muttered and made a decision. He would wait until everyone had dispersed and find out what she was carrying in there. The moment of truth. The restaurant emptied and silence filled the room. Emily had stayed late, as usual. Her slender fingers deftly wiped the dishes and her gaze occasionally slid to the clock. That's it, almost done, she whispered under her breath, adjusting her bonnet. Her movements were getting faster and faster, as if something was rushing her. James, who was watching from his car parked a few blocks away from the restaurant, was getting impatient. Come on already, Emily, show me what you're hiding. And so she got out. Her backpack looked like half the kitchen had been stuffed into it. Emily stopped at the door, took a quick glance around, and headed towards the bus stop, calming down. Hey, Emily. James stepped out of the car, his voice breaking the silence of the street. She flinched and looked back, her face pale as a sheet. Mr. James? What are you doing here? Me? I'm the one who wants to ask you what you're doing here. And more importantly, what's in your backpack? In my backpack? It's just, my stuff in there. Stuff? A backpack that big? Look, let's not play cat and mouse. Open it. Now. Emily froze like a deer in front of headlights. Her hands trembled, but she slowly unzipped. Okay, just please don't scream. James tensed, expecting to see anything, stolen groceries, bottles of wine, or even dishes. But what he saw turned his mind upside down. Inside, amidst a rolled-up blanket and a stack of diapers, a tiny baby girl slept peacefully. What the words stuck in his throat. Emily gently removed the baby girl and cradled her against him, as if protecting her from an unseen threat. This is my daughter, Kate, her voice trembled. Please don't tell anyone. The explanation began. James didn't know what to say. He stood there as if thunderstruck, and the words just wouldn't form into sentences. You carried a baby to work? Emily, is this a joke? I had no other choice. She blurted out, and her eyes filled with tears. I can't leave her alone, we have no one. No one to help. James sighed, crouched down on the curb and ran his hands over his face. He had no idea how to respond to this. Okay, he finally said, start at the beginning. Why are you in this situation? Emily lowered her gaze, bit her lip, and said quietly. It's a long story. Let's imagine for a second, you're standing in front of your boss with a backpack with your baby sleeping in it. How do you explain it so you don't end up on the street in 5 minutes? Would you tell the truth or make something up as you go along? Emily chose the first option. But her story was so unexpected that even James, a man of iron logic, couldn't believe his ears. Emily clutched her backpack as if she wanted to hide not only the baby girl, but all her shame. James, sitting across from her, looked dumbfounded, but his eyes began to fill with something that looked like understanding. Or maybe pity? She didn't know. Well, why don't you say something? Come on, tell me. How come the kid ended up as your partner in the dishwashing? His tone was softer than she'd expected, but there was still a hardness to it. Emily sighed, fixed her hair, which had fluttered in a gust of wind, and began to speak. Quietly, as if she was afraid that every fact she told might be another accusation. I know it seems weird. But honestly, I just didn't know what else to do, she began, looking away so she wouldn't meet his gaze. It all started a few years ago, when I first moved to this town. Back then, I thought things would get better. But it turns out that life likes to throw up surprises. James listened silently, propping his head up with his hand. He didn't rush her, though he was torn with questions. When I was 16, my mom died and my dad just disappeared like he never existed. All that was left was my grandmother, but it was hard for her to raise me alone. Then I decided that I would do everything on my own, my studies, my job, my house. No matter how hard it was, I did my best. But you know what the funny thing is? Life always finds a way to bring you to your knees, even when you're struggling to stay on your feet. Her voice trembled a little, but she quickly pulled herself together and continued. I met Tom at one point. He was, you know, the kind of guy who knows how to talk pretty. I thought he was the one, that he would help me get out of this rut. And, you know, he did. Really only in one way, realizing how naive I was. James couldn't hold back a slight chuckle. He was already starting to imagine the type. As soon as I found out I was pregnant, he disappeared. Took everything he could, money, jewelry, even my old laptop. And I was left alone, with debts and fear of what would happen next. I decided I wouldn't ask anyone for anything, I'd do it on my own. But it turned out to be harder than I thought. James felt something inside him clench. He understood that life could be cruel, but hearing this from Emily was especially hard. When Kate was born, I was happy no matter what. But the joy was quickly replaced by panic. My milk was gone, and formula cost so much that my paycheck barely covered it for a couple of weeks. I had to scrape by. When I heard your restaurant needed employees, I thought it was a chance. Working nights is perfect because Kate could be there. Yeah, I knew it was wrong, but what was I supposed to do? A neighbor who sometimes sat with Kate said she couldn't help anymore. So I made up my mind. James listened to her with such attention that he seemed oblivious to everything else. Emily looked at him, expecting judgment, accusations, anything. But instead he sighed and said, Okay, why didn't you come to me right away? I don't bite, you know. Her eyes widened in surprise. You're not mad? Angry? Yes. But only at a system that puts people like you in a dead end. You could have just said. Hell, Emily, I would have helped. Yeah, I may not be the kindest guy in the world, but I certainly wouldn't leave someone on the street. He stood up, walked back and forth, and then added. But you know what, this isn't over. If you thought that was the biggest problem, I'm afraid you were wrong. Emily frowned, not sure what he meant. What do you mean? James stopped, looked her straight in the eye, and said quietly. Those who leave you in trouble don't always leave forever. Sometimes they come back. And I have a sneaking suspicion it's going to be quite soon. Emily felt her heart sink. What do you mean? You're Tom. Or someone who thinks they have the right to interfere in your life. People like that always come back, especially when they feel you found a way to survive. And we need to be ready. Her eyes filled with anxiety. She wanted to ask how he knew that, but something in his gaze told her, he knew what he was talking about. Emily sat there, trying to comprehend what she'd heard. All she wanted was to keep her daughter safe. And now it appeared that the problems were just beginning. James, meanwhile, grabbed his phone and dialed something quickly. Look, you're probably not used to help. But you're going to have to accept it. You're not going to work tomorrow. We'll think it over and find a solution. Understood? She nodded, though everything inside her was screaming with excitement. And don't think about disappearing. We're not done with this conversation yet, he added with a smile. Emily only managed a quiet reply. Thank you. The next morning, Emily still felt wrecked after yesterday. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, scrolling through James' words. Why did he say that about Tom? What does he even know about my life? The thoughts swirled around in her head like a raven. She was afraid to open up to anyone, but there was a certainty in his words. James seemed to be talking for a reason. Kate slept peacefully beside him, sniffling lightly. Looking at her daughter, Emily sighed. Her life had become like an endless struggle, one day survived, and she was already a success. She got up quietly, so as not to wake the baby, pulled on a warm sweater and went into the kitchen. James had left some bills on the table. She took the money, counted it out absent-mindedly. Enough to buy formula and diapers, but she was uncomfortable. It's just an advance, she reassured herself, but the bitterness remained. At that moment, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Emily flinched. No one had come to her door since this morning, and that made her uneasy. She looked through the peephole, but no one was there. Who's there? Her voice sounded quieter than she intended. There was no response. She slowly turned the lock, but no sooner had she opened the door than a sharp jolt made her jerk back. A tall man in a leather jacket piled into the apartment, followed by two others. Hey, take it easy," muttered one of them, smiling pretentiously. "What are you so scared of us for, Emily? We just want to talk." She realized that these were the same people who had already come to see her a couple of months ago. "Go away. I already told you I'm not selling anything." Her voice got firmer, but inside everything was trembling. "Come on," the man in the jacket said, nodding at the baby who was starting to wake up from the noise. "Think about the baby. You don't want anything to happen to her, do you?" Emily felt a cold sweat run down her back. She silently took a step back, trying to reassure Kate, but the little girl could no longer be fooled, she was crying. The man took a step closer, but suddenly the phone rang. Emily didn't immediately realize it was her machine lying in the kitchen. She glanced in the direction of the ringing phone and then at the men. "Go pick up the phone." "But I warn you, no fooling around," one of them said, pointing to the phone. Emily went to the desk, grabbed the phone, and saw James' name on the screen. She quickly answered it. "Hello?" Her voice was strained. "Emily, is everything okay? You sound kind of weird." James' voice was calm but wary. She was about to reply that everything was fine, but the man next to her stepped closer and whispered something in her ear. "Tell me it's okay. And don't you dare set us up." Emily felt her hand begin to tremble. "Yeah, it's fine," she uttered, trying to remain calm. But James obviously sensed something. "Look, are you home?" "Yeah." "Wait for me. I'm on my way." He hung up without letting her say another word. Emily put the phone down, looking at the men. She realized that James could be in danger if he decided to intervene. "Look, let's not make a scene," she said, trying to keep her composure. "Just go away. I don't have anything you want." "Oh, we wouldn't be so sure," the man in the jacket laughed. "But you're right, we don't need a scene. We'll just wait for your friend." Emily felt her heart clench. A few minutes later, there was a loud knock on the door. "Open up." James' voice was so loud that the walls seemed to falter. The man in the jacket gestured for his underlings to calm down, then opened the door. "Oh, hello, and you must be James. To what do we owe your visit?" But James didn't bother to explain anything. His gaze was so hard that even the bravest of the trio felt uncomfortable. "All three of you, out. Now," he said quietly, but so confidently that it sounded like an order. "Ha, are you scaring us or something?" laughed the man in the jacket. James took a step closer, then slowly pulled out his phone and turned on the camera recording. "One more word and the police will be here in 10 minutes. Go ahead and make up your mind." His confidence had an effect. The men looked at each other and then, without a word, headed for the exit. When the door closed behind them, Emily sank to the floor exhaustedly. James, putting his phone away, walked over and sat down next to her. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though she was shaking in a way that was hard to hide. "Who are they?" he asked quietly. They want me to sell the apartment. They've been threatening for months now. I thought they'd back off, but—" "I see," James interrupted her. "So now you're not staying here for a minute. Pack your things, you're coming to my place." "What?" "No, I can't." "You can," he said firmly. "I know you're used to handling things on your own. But this isn't the case. You have a child, Emily. You can't take any chances." Her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to object, but she realized he was right. "Okay," she whispered, feeling gratitude growing inside, mixed with desperation. James stood up, walked to the door and looked out into the hallway. Then turned around and added, "One more thing. You're not alone anymore. Remember that." Emily felt tears begin to roll down her cheeks. But this time they were tears of relief. Emily sat on the edge of the couch in James' apartment, feeling like a stranger. The spacious living room, the big TV, the perfect cleanliness, it all seemed unreal to her. Her gaze slid over the interior, stopping at the details. She couldn't even remember the last time she'd seen a room where everything was so neat. Kate, nestled in her new crib, was quietly snoozing. James, meanwhile, was in the kitchen. The noise of the pots and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee was slightly soothing. "Would you like some tea?" Suddenly came his voice from around the corner. Emily flinched. "Yes, thank you," she replied, trying to sound calm. James came out a minute later with 2 mugs. He held one out to her and sat down across from her. "Have you calmed down a bit?" he asked, looking at her carefully. Emily nodded, though there was still a storm raging inside. "I don't know how to thank you," she uttered, lowering her gaze. "You don't. Just tell me what else you're hiding. I need to know so I can figure out how to help you." She froze, trying to find the words. "I've already told you everything. They want me to sell the apartment. I don't know why exactly they want it so badly. But I can't do it." James frowned, tapping his finger thoughtfully on his mug. "You know, those types don't just do anything. If they're so persistent, there must be something behind it. Are you sure there's nothing wrong with the apartment? No debts, no hidden histories?" Emily shrugged. "I don't. I got the apartment from my grandmother. She always said it was our home, our fortress. I have no idea why anyone would be interested in her." James nodded, but you could tell something was eating him up. "Okay. We'll figure it out. But first you need to get some rest. You look like you haven't slept in a week." Emily wanted to object, but he stood up abruptly, waving his hand. "No argument. You're safe, the baby's asleep. Everything else can wait." He headed into the other room, leaving her alone. Emily sat staring into her cup. For the first time in a long time, she felt at least somewhat secure. But that feeling was as fragile as thin ice. She knew that sooner or later the past would return. The next day, James came home with a folder of papers. Emily, who was just trying to rock Kate, looked at him in surprise. "What's this?" she asked, nodding at the folder. "It's the paperwork for your apartment. I checked to see what I could find out." She froze, feeling anxiety rising in her chest. "And what's in it?" James sat down across from her, dropping the folder on the table. "Turns out the land under your house is worth several times more than the house itself. I'm sure those types want to build something big there. There may already be plans in place that you don't know about. Emily felt anger overwhelm her. They have no right. It's our home. There's no right. But that won't stop them. People like that usually get what they want. The only question is how far they're willing to go. Emily clung tighter to Kate, who began to whimper. What am I supposed to do? I can't just run away. This is my home. James looked at her, his gaze serious. First, you have to protect your rights. Get a lawyer, sort out the paperwork. Second, don't show them you're afraid. They feed on fear, Emily. If you show weakness, they'll push even harder. She nodded, though her thoughts were too confused to process it all. What if they come again? James smiled, but there was something icy in his smile. Then I'll meet them. This time they'll be sorry they even bothered to stick around. A few days passed quietly. James helped Emily with her shopping, setting up the apartment so that she was more comfortable. She still felt uncomfortable, but she was slowly starting to get used to it. One evening they were sitting in the kitchen eating dinner. James seemed to be in a good mood. You know, I was thinking. Have you ever thought about changing jobs? Emily looked at him in surprise. Change? But I have enough problems as it is. Why do you ask? He shrugged. I just think you have the potential for something more. You're smart, responsible. Yes, the situation is difficult, but that doesn't mean you have to stay where you're struggling. Her eyes filled with tears. Do you really think that? Of course I do. It's not like I left you in my place for nothing. I can see that you can handle it. You just need some support. Emily lowered her gaze to hide her emotions. Thank you, James. You're the only one who believed in me. He smiled, but didn't say anything. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. James tensed, stood up, and walked to the entrance. Who's there? There was no answer. He opened the door and saw a man in a suit on the doorstep. Good evening. May I speak to Emily? James closed the door halfway, blocking the passage. Who are you and what do you want? The man smiled, pulling a business card from his pocket. My name is Mark. I'm an attorney. I represent those interested in buying her apartment. James took the business card, glancing at it briefly. Good. Then tell your clients there's no deal. And don't come here again. Mark sighed, shrugging his shoulders. We can always work out a deal, mister. I don't think so, James interrupted him, slamming the door shut. He walked back into the kitchen, trying to look calm. Who was that? Emily asked, looking at him anxiously. Just another representative of those who want to take your apartment. But that's okay, I'll deal with it. Emily felt the fear come over her again. But the moment she was about to say something, James put a hand on her shoulder. Emily, I promise. No one will ever dare threaten you and Kate again. I won't let that happen. She stared at him, not knowing what to say. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like everything was really going to be okay. Emily could no longer remember the last time she'd woken up feeling like the day wasn't going to be a new ordeal. But now, in James's apartment, she was beginning to feel something resembling security. Though the feeling was still as shaky as the sand beneath her feet. She got up earlier than usual, made breakfast, and sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The silence was broken only by the slight creak of the door. James appeared in the doorway with disheveled hair and a sleepy face. You got up before me? I thought that was impossible, he said, rubbing his eyes and sitting down across from me. Emily smiled. Habit. When you live alone with a baby, you don't get much sleep. James nodded, reaching for a cup of coffee. By the way, I've been thinking, he began, taking a sip from his mug. You're not going to spend the rest of your life hiding from these types, are you? Emily tensed. She knew this conversation was going to happen sooner or later, but she wasn't ready for it. What can I do? They're stronger, they have money, connections. I'm just a mother protecting her child. And that's enough, James interrupted her. Emily glanced at him, a little surprised at such certainty. Look, I talked to a man. He's a lawyer, specializes in these kinds of cases. If you want, he can help you deal with the apartment and those guys. She hesitated. She'd always been intimidated by lawyers and courts, but if it could stop the threats. You really think that's going to help? She asked, looking him straight in the eye. James nodded. Yes. And I'll be there for you if anything goes wrong. Those words awakened a strange feeling in Emily. She wasn't ready to trust anyone, but James somehow inspired confidence. Okay. Let's give it a try, she finally said. James smiled. That's fine. Then we'll go out with him tomorrow. In the meantime, relax. Today is your day off. The day went surprisingly quiet. James spent most of his time at work, leaving Emily to spend time with Kate. She played with the baby, laughed, felt a little of the old tension go away. But in the evening, as the sun was already sinking below the horizon, her peace of mind was once again threatened. The doorbell rang. James, who was just preparing dinner, quickly wiped his hands on a towel and headed for the door. Who's up all night? He muttered. Emily remained in the living room, listening. Good evening, Mr. James, right? The voice was low, calm, but there was a sense of menace in it. Who's asking? Never mind. I'm here on business concerning Miss Emily. May I come in? No, James replied firmly, closing the passage with himself. Okay. Then I will speak here. My employers are very unhappy with her refusal to cooperate. I would advise you to convince her to reconsider her decision. Otherwise, this could end up being unpleasant. James stared at the man in silence. His face became hard as stone. Tell your employers that if they continue to make threats, they will be in trouble. And now leave before I change my mind. The man grinned slightly, turned and walked away leisurely. Closing the door, James walked back into the living room, trying not to show his unease. Who was that? Emily asked immediately, feeling her heart start to pound faster. Never mind. Just another clown who thinks he can intimidate us. Don't worry, I'll deal with it. But Emily couldn't help but worry. Her fears returned, reminding her that safety was only an illusion. The next day they met with the lawyer James had recommended. He was a gray-haired man with a shrewd eye and a firm voice. He listened carefully to Emily's story, going over her paperwork. Strange, he said, turning a page. It says here that the title to the land under the house is held by a private company. But your grandmother's will doesn't mention anything about that. Emily frowned. What does that mean? It means that someone may have forged the documents to claim the land. But that can be challenged in court. James chuckled slightly. There you go. We got them. But the lawyer shook his head. Not so fast. If they've gone for forgery, they're not likely to just stop. We need to be prepared for them to fight. Emily felt the anxiety rising in her chest again. What am I going to do? The lawyer set the papers aside and looked at her. Just tell me, are you willing to go all the way? It may be long and hard, but if you want to keep your home, there's no other way. She looked at James, who nodded, encouraging her. I'm ready, she finally said. The lawyer smiled. Good. Then we'll get started. That evening, James had a small dinner to celebrate the first step in the fight for her house. You know, you were a real heroine tonight, he said, filling her glass with juice. Emily laughed. You make it sound like I saved the world. For Kate, that's exactly what you did, he replied seriously. Her smile grew softer. She looked at James and thought about how much he had changed her life in such a short time. But deep down she knew that this was only the beginning. She had a long road ahead of her, full of challenges. And yet, for the first time in a long time, she had hope. The evening was strangely quiet. Emily had put Kate to bed, and when she went out into the living room, she found James sitting pensively on the couch with his phone in his hands. His face was focused, and his fingers were tapping nervously on the screen. He was obviously thinking about something, and judging by the tension in his posture, it wasn't a happy one. "Are you all right?" Emily asked cautiously, taking a seat next to him. James looked at her as if he'd just woken up from a bad dream, and smiled slightly. "It's fine. Just wondering what else I can do to make you feel safe." Emily lowered her eyes in embarrassment. "You've already done more for us than anyone ever has. You don't need to do anything more." "Emily, I can't turn a blind eye to what's going on. These people won't stop until they get what's coming to them. Which means you have to stay one step ahead of them." She sighed. "I don't know, James. Sometimes I think it would be easier to just give up. Go somewhere else, start over." His eyes are sharp as a blade. "No. You don't have to run. You don't have to give in to them. This isn't just a house. It's your life, your right to peace." His words came out so firmly that Emily had no doubt he meant it. "Okay," she whispered, feeling a new confidence building inside her. "What do you suggest?" "We'll make some calls tomorrow. I know people who can dig deeper. Find out all about the people behind this." The next day, James really didn't waste any time. While Emily was busy with Kate, he was calling some people, finalizing details, making appointments. Emily couldn't hear all the conversation, but her anxiety was gradually being replaced by the feeling that she was in good hands. Toward lunchtime, he approached her with a winning smile. "There's news. A friend of mine found something interesting. Those guys who came to see you are connected to a pretty big construction company. They're buying up land for a new project." "What project?" Emily frowned. "The usual office buildings," James answered, shrugging slightly. "But that's not the point. According to the documents, they already own part of your land. And that's their biggest mistake." She didn't immediately realize what he was getting at. "Why?" James grinned. "Because if they got that land illegally, we can force them to back off. No one wants a scandal, especially in a business like this." Emily felt hope spilling into her chest. "Do you think this will work?" "We'll find out," he answered confidently. But as James laid out his plan, life continued to remind him that it wasn't easy. That evening, when Kate was already asleep, there was a knock at the door. This time it wasn't one of the uninvited guests, but the lawyer they were working with. "Good evening," he said, entering. "I have some news for you." Emily and James immediately realized that the news would not be pleasant. "We checked the documents again. And it looks like they found a way around some of the laws. If they decide to go all the way, you may have no choice but to sell." Emily felt the ground go from under her feet. "But how?" "It's illegal." The lawyer shook his head. "They're operating on the edge of the law. And if you don't have serious support, it's going to be very difficult to win your case." James frowned. "Then we need support." "It's possible, but the lawyer hesitated. "It would be expensive. Very expensive." Emily covered her face with her hands. She didn't know how to react. "Look," James intervened. "We'll find a way. But you keep doing your job." The lawyer nodded and, wishing him luck, left. When the door closed, Emily was torn between anger and despair. "I can't go on like this, James. It's just not possible." "Emily. No, listen to me. I'm tired. I'm trying to do everything right, but it's all going wrong. Maybe they will win. Maybe I should just give up." James came closer, put his hands on her shoulders. "You're stronger than you think. You handled all of this alone, and you're not alone now. We'll figure it out. I promise." Those words were the anchor that kept her afloat. "Okay. Sighs, but if I start giving up again, remind me of that, okay? James smiled. I will. I promise. At night, Emily couldn't sleep for a long time. She thought about home, about how her grandmother had said this place was their fortress. She couldn't let it be taken away. As she looked at Kate sleeping peacefully in her crib, she realized she had to fight. Not for herself, for her. Emily no longer felt fear. There was determination in her heart now. She knew that there were many challenges ahead, but with James by her side, everything seemed possible. That thought allowed her to finally close her eyes. A new day awaited them tomorrow, and she was ready for it. The next day, the atmosphere in James's apartment was tense but determined. Emily felt a renewed vigor from the morning. James looked focused as always, but there was a confidence in his gaze that was transmitted to her. We're going to see this through today, he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. No compromises. Emily nodded. She knew this was their last chance. What are we going to do? James smiled. For starters, a meeting with their representatives. They need to realize that you're not to be trifled with. Emily shuddered, but not out of fear. A strange feeling came over her. She felt for the first time that she could be something more than just a vulnerable mother. The meeting was scheduled at the office of the company that owned the people who had threatened Emily. James had insisted that she not go alone. He, as usual, was her support. They were met in the office by a man in an expensive suit with a cold stare. On the desk were papers, obviously prepared for signing. Miss Emily, Mr. James. Glad you could make it. I hope we can find a compromise that will suit both sides, he said, displaying a polite smile that sent shivers down her spine. Emily glanced at James, and he nodded at her. We have a proposition, he began. You leave Emily and her apartment alone. We know your paperwork is a sham. And if you want to keep that information between us, you'd better back off. The man laughed restrainedly. Is that a threat? James stepped forward, his voice low and hard. No. It's a warning. The conversation went on for about an hour. Emily remained silent, letting James do the talking. She watched him and marveled at how confidently he defended her interests. At one point, the man in the suit lost his cool. Okay. We can renegotiate, he said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. But only if you guarantee that you won't take legal action against us. James didn't answer right away. He looked at Emily. It's up to you, he said. Emily took a deep breath. She realized that her future was being decided. I'll do it. But only if you leave us alone forever. The man nodded. It's a deal. As they walked out of the building, Emily was relieved. James looked back at her and smiled. You made it through. She nodded, feeling the tension of the last few weeks drain out of her. Thank you, James. I could never have done it without you. He looked at her, his eyes soft. You did it all on your own. I was just there for you. Emily couldn't help herself and hugged him. In that moment, she realized that he had become more than just a savior to her, but something much more. That evening, at home, they sat in the kitchen, drinking tea. Kate was asleep in her crib, and Emily could afford to relax for the first time in a long time. What's next? She asked, looking at James. He smiled. What's next is for you to live your life. You're going to live your life happily ever after. And you? James hesitated, but his gaze remained warm. Me? I'll be there for you. If that's what you want, of course. Emily laughed, tears welling up in her eyes. Of course I do. And in that moment it became clear to her that all the hardships she had gone through had led her to a new life. A life where she not only had a home, but also someone to rely on. Emily's story ended not just with a victory over her circumstances, but the beginning of something real. She realized that she can be strong, but sometimes strength is about accepting help and opening her heart to new possibilities. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share the video and subscribe to the channel. Your comments and support help us create more content that inspires you. Together, we can overcome any challenges and create more of these exciting stories. If you have any ideas or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'm always happy to hear what you think. I also want to apologize for possible errors in the text, as I am not a native speaker and use the help of artificial intelligence. My work may lack subtle nuances of language, so I apologize for that. I am always looking to improve my skills to create more interesting and accurate content for you. Thank you for sticking with us. There are many more interesting and exciting stories to come.